Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all can hear me okay. Very good. Thank you so much for sticking around for the end of our program. We truly have an exciting moment for you today. My name is Tamara Rocha. I am an attorney at the Rhode Island Supreme Court, where I serve as the director of the Access to Justice Office. I have the distinct honor of sitting with Judge Myron Thompson to reflect further on the 13th Amendment. Judge Thompson was nominated to United States District Judge for the Middle District of Alabama in September 1980 by President Jimmy Carter. He served as Chief Judge from 1991 to 1998. Judge Thompson is a graduate of Yale College and Yale Law School. He served as an Assistant Attorney General of Alabama from 1972 to 1974. He was the first African-American Assistant Attorney General for the state of Alabama, the first African-American bar examiner for the state, and the second African-American federal judge in the state. Judge Thompson was in private practice from 1974 until 1980. He was a founding director and board chairman of the Alabama Legal Services Corporation. As Chief Judge, he was instrumental in preserving the Montgomery bus station where the Freedom Riders were attacked in 1961 and in establishing the Freedom Rides Museum. In May 2022, Yale University awarded an honorary Doctor of Laws degree to Judge Thompson and stated, "Audacious advocate and learned legal scholar. You have made justice both a career and a calling. In the courtroom, you tenaciously defend equity, liberty, and dignity for all. In the classroom, you teach others to walk the same path. Your long service to your home state inspires us. Your commitment to your alma mater humbles us. As a testament to your impact, and with the utmost pleasure, we award you your third Yale degree, Doctor of Laws." Not to be outdone, in September 2022, in celebration of Judge Thompson's 4 decades on the bench, former President Jimmy Carter, in a letter, commended Judge Thompson for his enduring commitment to fairness, civil rights, and protecting the rule of law, and observed that he has emerged as a national leader in the effort to guarantee that all litigants receive equal justice before the law. Last year, he was honored at the United States Supreme Court with dinner hosted by Justices Jackson, Sotomayor, and Barrett. Please join me in welcoming Judge Thompson. So Judge Thompson, my understanding is that you were born in Tuskegee, Alabama.
Yes.
I would love to learn a little bit more about just your upbringing, the 13th Amendment, and how this all combines together to make you the person that you are today.
And you want that in an hour?
In an hour, if you can.
I'd like to first say, before I answer your question, that I thought I was going to be a member of a panel. Apparently, your group never got counting past 1, because I thought a panel had at least 2 on it. But here I am, as my fellow judge from Alabama always says when he gives speeches, I'm like the Kardashian, is that Kardashian women?
Kardashian.
What are they called? Whatever they're called, I'm like the Kardashian women. What they say to their men is, "I won't keep you long." So anyway, I'm not going to keep you long here. But I thought I would sort of recreate the notion of a panel. And this panel will consist in somewhat unusual, in an unusual way, in the sense that it will consist of me and my grandfather. I'd like to have a discussion with my grandfather, who I was born back in the 1980s, shortly after the Civil War, and, well, not shortly, but late in the 1980s, but who had parents and relatives who all were slaves. Of course, I'm a descendant of a slave. Some people say you're supposed to say descendant of people who were slaves. I'm a descendant of a slave. I mean, I'm proud of it. But I'd like to have a discussion with him. And this discussion is different, too, because our perspective or perspectives on slavery are not the same. So here you have to go back to 1972. I've just gotten out of law school. I've gone back to a little town in Alabama called Dothan. It's in the southeast corner of the state, basically known for growing peanuts. Decided to set up a law practice by myself. Hung out a shingle, bought an old house, lived in the back. People came in the front, and here I was, as we say, to do justice. My grandfather was from that community, and in fact, had been born in that community. He went through the 3rd grade, taught himself to read and write. And we would meet for lunch on Thursdays. And we talked about everything. At least he talked about everything. I rarely said anything. As any really good grandson would do, you listened. But one of his complaints was, I go to church all the time, which he was. In fact, he was a deacon in his church. In fact, he ran the church pretty much. And he would say, Myron, why are we always talking about slavery? Everywhere I go, I hear about slavery. Now, here I am from Yale Law School, and what is my purpose? I'm down there to help, to remedy the vestiges of slavery. And here is my grandfather saying to me, you know, we black folk, all we do is talk about slavery. This is a complaint. And I think it's a valid question for us today. And it's a question that I think that my grandfather probably shared with a lot of people. But to answer that question, I have to tell you a little bit about my grandfather. As I said, he went to the 3rd grade, taught himself essentially to read and write, bought a big farm, grew cotton, fairly big farm actually. First black family to have an electric churn. You know, people came from all over to see how to make butter without churning it. First black family to own a car. People came around to see that. But this is really what he did that was quite remarkable. He had 6 children, my mother being the oldest. When she reached the 8th grade, there was no public school for blacks. The public school was only for whites, so much for separate but equal. So he had to send his daughter to boarding school. And he had a second child, another daughter. She reaches 8th grade, and he sends her off to boarding school. In fact, my mother used to say, you know, when I left home in the 8th grade, I never came back home again. Has a third daughter, sends her off to boarding school, that is for high school, and then off to college after 8th grade. Finally, he has a son. Now, I don't know whether this is gender discrimination or not, but he said, I am not sending any more children off to school. So what he does is, he starts a school himself. He finds a principal, and he houses the principal in his house, on his farm. Years later, when I came back to Montgomery to be an assistant attorney general, I went to a doctor, and it was a black doctor, and it ended up that, as we were talking, that he knew my grandfather. And so at the end of his examining me, I said, well, how much do I owe you? And he said, you don't owe me anything. He said, you don't know who I am. I said, yeah, I know you are. He said, you know, when I was in high school, I stayed with your grandfather in his house. And I'm a doctor today. He says, I will never charge you a penny for what your grandfather did for me. So here's my grandfather asking this question: why do black people talk so much about slavery? It's a hard question to answer, because here's a man who, Thurgood Marshall was fighting in court, which of course I became a judge, so I know about the cases and so forth about desegregating the schools. In fact, I ended up presiding over a number of cases, those lingering desegregation cases in Alabama. But my grandfather didn't have Thurgood Marshall to file a lawsuit for him. He started a school on his own for black folk. And I've come to realize that his question, if he were here today, and then we were having this discussion, and by the way, his name was John Henry. We were a country. And also we called him Big Papa, just like in the movies. So I'd say, Big Papa, you keep talking about, why do we keep talking about slavery? Why is it every time I go to church, the minister is talking about slavery? What's the big deal about slavery? And I think my answer to him now would be, back then I would say, I'm here to do justice. I'm here to file some big lawsuit that's going to save black people and all that. I think what he was really saying to me is, why, when we go to church, do we talk so much about slavery is, why is it that we talk about slavery, but no one ever does anything about it? I think his point was that if you were sitting here today, he would say to me, Myron, I did something about the schools in our state. I did something about the poverty in our state. Myron, what are you doing about it? And that's the discussion I would have with my grandfather. So you might, in hearing his question, think, oh, this is just an old dude who knew slavery a lot better than I knew slavery. And in fact, he had talked to people who were slaves. And I think what he's saying is, you go to church and you talk about slavery, but the real question is, what are you doing about it? And when you talk about the vestiges of slavery, the question is, we can talk about slavery all day, but what are we doing about it? And that's the conversation I would have with him. Back then, I thought, to be quite candid with you, I thought he was a bit ashamed of it. I'm being very frank now. I thought he was saying, that a people could be enslaved might be something you could be ashamed of. But I think it was projecting. I don't think he was ashamed of slavery. I think what he was saying was, if you don't do anything, talk is no good. And if you go to church, and if all the minister is saying is slavery this and slavery that, and you're not doing anything, it's no good. So, to your question about me growing up in the 13th Amendment, that's the context in which I grew up with the 13th Amendment. And to this day, I would say the question posed to me as a judge, the question that was posed to me as a lawyer, the question that was posed to me back then was, we can talk about the 13th Amendment, but the more difficult question is, what are we doing about the vestiges? And I can say today, I've handled some very high-profile cases involving the hitching post in Alabama, outlawed that. Chain gangs, I stopped. One of my proudest cases was right after I got appointed to the bench. I had a case involving the use of deadly force. You all may not know this, it used to be legal to shoot someone if they ran from the police. I was the first judge to say, you can't do that. Unless they pose a danger, you can't shoot them. It was summary execution. In fact, there's a little story that goes along with that. I replaced another judge, I'm getting ahead of myself, named Frank Johnson. I was a young judge. I was 33 years old. And I think that decision came out 2 years, maybe when I was 35. And I was nervous. No other court in the country had done this. And, but I thought it was the right thing to do. The case goes up on appeal. And I was walking down the hall, and I ran into Frank Johnson, who I had replaced as a judge. And he said, heard your case is being argued in the 11th Circuit. And I said, yes. He says, what do you think about it? Because he's a Southern judge, so he's like, what do you think about it? You know, he's a Southern accent. So I said, well, I'm a little nervous about it. You know, there's no other case out there, and yeah, I'm nervous. And also, there'd been a newspaper article that said that I had invented the concept out of whole cloth. And to be candid with you, I wondered whether I had to. But he looked at me again and he said, Myron? I said, yeah. He says, aren't you appointed for life? I said, yes. He says, and they can't reduce your salary, can they? I said, no. You got a backbone, man? I said, yes. He said, well, what are you worried about? That was my grandfather speaking through Frank Johnson. So the 13th Amendment to me, in that sense, has been, as one person said earlier, you know, it has an enforcement clause in it, which I was reading. And I think the question is not so much whether Congress enforces it, but whether we as individuals, me as a judge, and I'd like to talk a little bit about how I see the challenge as a judge to enforce the 13th Amendment. And we talk about things like mass incarceration. I thought the last panel was phenomenal, especially the young man who had been imprisoned. And in fact, he stole a lot of my comments. Actually, Judith Resnick calls it massive incarceration because she says it has a racial aspect to it. But, you know, the question for me as a judge is, you know, what do I personally do? What can I do? And it does drive me every day as to how I resolve, in particular, criminal cases. You know, I was at a panel at Yale Law School just 2 weeks ago, and they were talking about what we could do about mass incarceration. And I volunteered during the panel and said, you know, no one's talked about judges. They talked about programs like the two people who were up here. They talked, and they talked about professors who write these phenomenal books, like the panel we just had. And, but no one talks about what judges can do about mass, as I said, what Judith called massive incarceration. And I think it is a question for the judiciary. It is a question for judges. My talk is supposed to be about the reckoning. I think that's the end of the program. I think the reckoning may very well be with us judges. What are we going to do about massive incarceration? A lot of people talked about what we do after we get out of prison. We have all these post-prison resources, not necessarily equally available throughout the country, but they appear to be very available in Massachusetts. I'll just stop there. But what do we do about when a defendant comes before a judge? What does each individual judge do with the 13th Amendment in mind? And I think that is a hard question to answer. And I think in many ways that's the question my grandfather is posing to me every time I sentence a young man. I'm going on and on. You know, you can interrupt me and ask another question, but when a young man comes before me, what do I do? Well, first of all, I think the panel was absolutely correct. You view them as individuals. You view them as humans. They're not numbers. I had a case involving the Alabama years ago, and a case involving the Alabama prison system, and this is an old case. I have one now, but this is even before that. And the defendants and the plaintiffs actually kept referring to some of the inmates by their numbers. And some of the inmates had died. So they would say inmate 1236, blank, 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 inmates 1247, blank, blank, blank. And it ended up the parents of some of these inmates were in the audience. And I'm a big reader of literature. I love to read. And I had just read, the Hardy poem about the soldier who goes off to war. And what Hardy does is, back then when soldiers would go off to war in the 1900s, they never had names. They would even use the dead soldiers as fertilizer and stuff like that. And Hardy gave the soldier a name. And the significance of the poem was that he was given a name. And so I was sitting there, and I'm thinking, we're talking about all these inmates. And I turned to the lawyers, and I said, and I actually told them about the Hardy poem, and I said, they need names. We're not going to use numbers anymore in the litigation. Every inmate will have a name. And then I later heard that the families in the audience were in tears, to hear their children no longer, well, deceased children, no longer referred to as numbers, but by names. And the second thing was, when defendants appear before me, as I said, I recognize them as human beings. But I think the real question also is, why are they before me? And the second question is, do I have to send them to jail? The first question is really important. I am a strong believer in having a full mental health evaluation done of every defendant. The number of defendants who have appeared before me who have mental health issues is staggering. I've had a defendant appear before me whom I declared incompetent, who had a record. First judge, just to even have him examined. So a full mental health, find out who they are, who are their families, how did they grow up? Quite often they grow up in poverty. The poverty itself can give them, PSTD. Mm-hmm. And the second question is, do I have to send them to jail? And that's for each judge individually. And I start with the presumption, why do I? Of course, we federal judges have the guidelines. I think there's some state judges here who, I don't know whether you're in Massachusetts, you have guidelines or not. But I'm a strong believer in alternative sentencing. Unless it's necessary to send someone to prison, don't do it. Don't look for reasons why someone should go off. Look for reasons as to why can't someone stay out. And to me, the guidelines are advisory, but I think they're set up to make the system fair. But I think the ultimate question for each individual judge is, do I send someone away or do I not? And as frontline judges, each of us can do something about massive incarceration. I think it's an individual responsibility. At that Yale meeting, they talked about everything except judges. In fact, I said, we judges are the gatekeepers of massive incarceration. And yet no one held us accountable. No one has said, what are we judges doing? This conference should be given to all federal judges so that they can hear the stories that were told earlier today. I'll wait for your next question.
Well, I think, going off of that, right? So when we talk about our justice system, we know that one of the barriers that people face is the trust in a system. And so how do we address and face our undeniable history and try to rebuild that trust within the community? And what role can our judges, our lawyers, our students that are here today, what can we do to move forward to build that trust?
I think trust is critical to our system. I think it requires that judges get out there and be seen. I think it requires that, and I often do it, that when a judge gives a sentence, the judge should explain why they're sentencing someone and why it's necessary to send them to prison rather than to some alternative means of punishment. I think articulating reasons are a good way to force you to confront why you're doing something. It's easy to knee-jerk. I think it's important to have the victims present so that they can explain their views as well. I think the person who spoke about restorative justice hit the nail on the head about restorative justice. And restorative justice doesn't always mean that the defendant goes free. That's not what that system is about. The system is about coming up with a system that is fair, because victims are entitled to justice, and they should be heard, and they must be heard. So, but it's a way of bringing everyone together, and I think that that he spoke very, very cogently, and I think he summarized the system very well. I would like to be more involved in restorative justice. I'm just learning about it myself. I think it is a way to address mass incarceration, but which is to me what is the issue to me today. We talk about our criminal justice system, but I think restorative justice is definitely one big issue. If you were to ask me, though, what is the issue today in the criminal justice system, in the sense of not mass incarceration, but what do I confront aside from finding alternatives to incarceration? I'd give you one word: guns. Guns, guns, guns. I would say 50% of all the defendants that I have who come before me are there for gun violations. I understand the Second Amendment and I respect it. I understand the right to have guns, but these guns are destroying our young boys. And they parade before me, and I try to understand, and when they come before me, we start out by discussing who they are. And then I'll quite often ask the lawyer, do you mind if I talk to the defendant directly? And it's amazing how often lawyers will say that because they have no idea what the defendant's going to say. And I'll say, why did you have the gun? And of course, they'll usually give me the answer, well, I wanted it for protection. Don't always buy that. I'm not a dummy. And I know when I'm being had. So, but nonetheless, it's just throughout the system. It's just so many of them have these guns, and they come before me, and quite often the guidelines are so high, and if they're coming before you with several gun convictions, you may be forced to incarcerate them. But you also can't let them go back out there and have a gun again. So what do you do? What do you do with a defendant who comes before you having had a gun 3 times, third conviction. Am I supposed to let him go back out there? This is Frank Johnson used to say, put it down where the goats can get it. This is putting it down where the goats can get it. That's a hard question. If I put him in jail, I'm basically going to let him learn how to get better with guns and learn all the other vices that he may not already know. And he's probably been in jail a couple of times anyway. If I send him back out, the likelihood he's going to get a gun again is extremely high because, I'll be honest with you, most of these young men, in fact, I had one last week, given a gun at the age of 12 as a gift. So what do you do? I've started actually trying to get treatment for people to teach them how to exist in a violent world without a gun, how to cope without guns. I don't know if there's an answer to that, but I'm searching for it, and I'm unwilling to give up on, and I'm unwilling to give up on these young men. How to cope in a violent world without a gun, knowing that if you have a gun, you're going to go away for a long time. And these are the questions we judges face. And it's a good question for me. I don't have a total answer for it. I don't know of any other judge who's even asked the question, though. But I think it's a good question.
Thank you. We have just a couple more minutes. And so I do want to ask you this question. You and I were sitting here, 160 years, reflecting on the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Yourself, a descendant of enslaved, myself, descendant of enslaved. What do you think that those who have come before us would say about the progress that we've made and where we are today? And what do you think we need to do to continue evolving?
Wow, that's a very, very hard question. I guess I would say, what would my grandfather say? Since as you can, I've made clear, he's figured so prominently in my life, even though we may have differed about the significance of talking about slavery. You know, it's funny, the older you get, and the older I get, the wiser he seems to have become. But anyway, so I'll talk about it through his eyes. When I was sworn in, he did not see my ceremony. He was sitting on the front row, didn't see a bit of the ceremony because he cried the whole time. I was looking at him, he just couldn't stop crying. But anyway, I think he would pose the same question that he posed to me, you know, that really hard question about, you know, we can have all the theory, we can have all this talk, but for me the question is, what are we going to do about young black men with guns? And that is a hard question. If I had my legacy, if I was going to try to do something, that's what I would do. I would try to do something about that. I wrestle with it every day. As the defendant walks out of the courtroom, either I've sent him off to be incarcerated, or I've sent him off for mental health treatment, or I've done this to come up with some remedy or punishment or whatever. The last thing I say to him is, you know you can't have a gun. You know you can't have a gun. I don't know if it works or not. I don't think it does, to be quite candid with you. I think that the problem is more massive than that. I think that the problem is that you can't teach someone about that. It's more pervasive than just a judge saying it from the bench. Actually, earlier, getting back to earlier in the program, to just show you how pervasive the problem is, I had a case years ago involving a woman. She was 50 years old. She was before me for drugs. I was looking at her history. At the age of 8, she'd been raped and put into the mental health system because she obviously had PTSD. And her family couldn't control her. And she then went into the foster care system. By the way, while she was in the mental health system and then the foster care system, she received no education at all, no schooling. By the way, this is not 50 years ago. This is maybe 20 or 30 years ago. She then goes into the state prison system. She then goes into the federal system, and she's now before me. And I'm supposed to sentence her. I told you I was a reader. And you know what dawned on me? I had just read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I don't know how many of you know the story of Frankenstein. And I know we have the old movie from the 1930s, but that's not really what I'm talking about. In Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Frankenstein, who's really the doctor, creates this monster. And in the book, the monster is not all bad. You know what makes the monster bad? People. He learns how to be bad. And then the monster, at the end of the novel, says to Dr. Frankenstein, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" Obviously, it has religious meaning as well. And so in other words, Frankenstein, who ends up killing people, in fact, he wants to kill the doctor who made him, but he says, "Why did you forsake me? You made me, and now you are trying to kill me." And so I thought to myself, this woman who's appearing before me, who went into the mental health system, the foster care system, the state prison system, the federal prison system, and now I'm supposed to punish her based on what the state has made her? It's a Frankenstein. I'm punishing her for being who she is, and yet it's the state that made her who she is. So to answer your question, it's really so hard because it really goes back to our public schools. You know, guns, it goes back to, are we adequately funding public schools? It goes back to, we talk about the police force. It goes back to having well-trained police officers. It goes back to a community that, addressing poverty in the community itself. It's almost so big that my head just kind of swirls in it. But when we take these children and put them in foster care, and you can rest assured, a lot of the kids, defendants who come before me, come right out of foster care, come right out of the mental health system, and they're right into the prison system, or they're homeless. Until we address all of that, I don't know. It's just a very, very big problem. All I can say is that each of us has to do our own individual little thing to help, which gets back to my grandfather. If you don't have a school, start one. Do your little thing, and that helps the whole system. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
That does. I think we have time for just a couple of questions. Are there any questions in the audience?
Yeah, I think you have two right there.
It's not working.
Oh, yeah. I realize you're on a federal bench, but what, how do you factor in, or how does a judge who's trying to do what you're doing factor in the fact that, let's say, in the state of Alabama, a sentence to at least a certain of the prisons amounts to a death penalty, or serious bodily harm, or just state of the prison system there apparently is just horrendous beyond imagining. And how does a judge who's trying to be conscientious factor that in?
Yeah, I have a problem. I can't answer that one for two reasons. Number one is that issue is before me, but secondly, you're asking me about a legal issue about how to remedy something legally, and you'll have to. What is a filing fee in federal court right now? You'll have to pay the filing fee, and I'll answer it in order. That's what I tell people when they ask me those questions like that. But any other questions? I really can't answer that one. Yes.
I can just shout.
Yes.
First of all, welcome to Rhode Island. Many of us visited you. You and your colleagues hosted us in the Middle District. We've talked a lot about criminal aspects after slavery, but one of your huge histories is in the civil side. And in particular, people may not know that you presided in what is referred to as America's courtroom.
Right.
And your colleagues have as well, because it was the location where Judge Johnson sat, and Bloody Sunday, the bus boycott, Rosa Parks, all went through your courtroom.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you can just touch a little bit about that legacy, and then secondly, it's been a pretty heavy day.
I'm ready to go.
And I'm wondering if you could just end us by telling us a story about when Judge Johnson made a criminal assignment to you.
Yes, I will. Okay.
And you had to find your witness.
I'll end it with the two matters, and it has been a long day. And I did promise that I wouldn't keep you long, if I remember correctly. I want to give well, first of all, I'll talk about the courtroom itself. It is an incredible courtroom. It was a courtroom where a judge known as Judge Frank Johnson, and I call him one of the greatest judges that ever lived. And someone asked me, what is a great judge? And I said, that's a judge who's able to rule in favor of someone who does not like them, who is not like them at all. In other words, that's when you're totally neutral. In other words, you can rule for a Muslim if you're a Christian, or if you're a Christian, you can rule for a Muslim. Things don't matter. You don't have a niche. You can rule for a gay person if you're straight, or a straight person if you're gay. And you can rule for a white person if you're black, or a black person if you're white. Judge Johnson was all of those things. He always ruled for people who were not like him. He ruled for black people, he ruled for women, he ruled for gays. He wasn't any of those things. And that, to me, what goes into being a great judge. You understand what it's like to be everybody. And that's that courtroom where he presided in. And so when Dr. King wanted to march from Selma to Montgomery, his case was before Judge Johnson. And Judge Johnson initially actually enjoined the march, but later allowed it to allow for traffic to proceed. And as we know, what was the result of it? It was the Voting Rights Act. He ruled for prisoners. As far as I know, he had no criminal record. He ruled for the mentally ill. You know, he found that basically what Alabama was doing was warehousing the mentally ill. That's what he said, warehousing the mentally ill. There was a place in one room where something like 200 people had one bathroom. It was just horrible. He ruled for desegregation, you know, parks, public transportation, all of it. He definitely was not a black man. That's what made him so amazing, is that he was able to do this. And this is sort of the cherry on it, he grew up in Alabama. So it's not always where you're from. It's your ability to learn and to know. That's so important. Now, the final story about Judge Johnson. As I told you, I went back to Alabama as a lawyer and set up this little law practice, and got paid very little. Uh, uh, basically, my idol was Jimmy Stewart in the movie Anatomy of a Murder. I don't know how many of you have seen that. And, I just had an old house, and I even had a friend, and at night, we would have a scotch and discuss law. And we had a little back room where if we lost a case, we called it the recovery room, where we would take our clients. And I even had a surly secretary, just like in the movie, Eve Arden. And she would, it says, one day we'll get paid, right? Very dedicated, but she knew that the salary wasn't always there. But anyway, my first federal trial was before Judge Johnson, and I was in my office. My secretary comes in and says, Judge Johnson wants you over at the courthouse. And he was a very stern man. It's amazing, too. You always think of judges as stern, and he was stern. But his rulings were so soft and heartwarming. It's amazing about the contrast. You would think that he would be a harsh man, and he was. But his rulings had so much humanity in them. And anyway, so I'm appearing before him as the harsh judge. And I'm shaking. And I walk in, and he says, I got a case for you, Myron. And he says, I got a defendant out here. His relationship with his lawyer has broken down, and I want you to represent him. And in fact, I think this is one of the first cases that a lawyer had been appointed in the federal court system by the court itself, and we were paid by the court. And I said, oh, fine. He said, by the way, I'm like 26 years old. And I go out, I talk to him. I'm sure he's quaking because he has this little 26-year-old boy-looking lawyer who's supposed to represent him. And the reason it was in federal court was the offense had taken place on a federal installation. And I think he was charged with something like stealing or something like that. And I talk to him, and he tells me his story, and I decided that this guy's guilty as hell. I mean, there's just no way. I mean, there were 4 people in the car. He's guilty. And I go back into Judge Johnson, and I say, okay, I've talked to him, and I said, when do we go to trial? He said, tomorrow. I don't know how many judges are here. You can't do that today in the federal system, by the way. But back then, there were no such things as a Speedy Trial Act and so forth. It meant you had 30 days. Even if there had been one, Judge Johnson probably wouldn't have recognized it. But anyway, so he said tomorrow. So I go back, and I talk to my client again. I go back, I talk to my secretary. I call up a few old lawyers, and we talk about the case. And finally, my client's talked to him again. He says, I have a witness who can get me off. And I said, well, who is it? He says, his name is Joe. And I said, what is Joe's last name? I don't know. And I said, so you have a witness named Joe. Where does Joe live? I don't know. And so he says, can you just give me anything? He said, well, I think he moved away. Where did he move to? I think it's Colorado. And somewhere out west. So I had my secretary, who's still there, type up a subpoena for Joe. I knew that my head was going to be bitten off when I delivered that subpoena to Judge Johnson to subpoena Joe. And do you know what? He signed it. He ordered the FBI to find Joe. I go back to my office and I pray. And that's all I had. I get a call at midnight. Yeah, I was up drinking a scotch with my friend, debating what I was going to say at the trial tomorrow. They say, we found Joe. He has a ticket, and he's on his way on his way to Alabama. And you can meet him at the airport And then also, it ends up that I said, well, let me put him on. Let me talk to him. And Joe verifies everything my client said. Not only does he do that, he was a police officer. So we get Joe. I meet him at the airport. Back then, you know, we had tape recorders because, you know, we didn't have these cell phones and so forth. So I meet him at the airport with my tape recorder because I want to get him on tape before the U.S. attorney does. And I, in fact, take him to the courthouse and walk him into the U.S. attorney's office. Says, here's Joe. My client is telling the truth. Go up to Judge Johnson's office. He says, we'll dismiss the charges. And Judge Johnson looks at me, he winks at me, and he says, well, I guess you found Joe. Actually, I tell that story mainly to defenders. And the reason I tell it to defenders is it tells the importance of a criminal justice system in which you have a judge who cares about each defendant individually. Joe was not someone who, if Judge Johnson had denied that subpoena, there's nothing I could have done. I could have taken it up to the Supreme Court. There's nothing I could do about it because there was no last name. Secondly, he gave me the entire FBI to find Joe. How many judges in this country would do that? And that story is to let those people who care about little people and who go before a judge who also cares about little people, you really can do justice. And the system can really work sometime. Unfortunately, Judge Johnson doesn't, he's passed on. Not all judges work on the premise of Judge Johnson. But I think it is a story worth telling over and over again. And I should have told it to those lawyers, those students at Yale Law School, when they were talking about mass incarceration. I said, the problem is us judges. We need more Frank Johnsons. Thank you very much.